If you've ever been the one in the family who does everything right but gets treated like you're invisible, then you need to hear this. If you've ever been told you're being too sensitive when you were justifiably hurt, or watched someone else get all the credit for your hard work, then this story is for you. My name is Felicity, and for 35 years, I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the family's sturdy, unremarkable foundation. And then, with the reading of a single document, I found out that a foundation is just something people walk all over to get to where they want to go. This is the story of how they left me with a worthless swamp, and how I used it to drown them in their own greed. It all began, as these things so often do, in a sterile, beige-walled lawyer's office that smelled of old paper and pending disappointment. The air was thick with the kind of forced solemnity that only follows a death in a wealthy family. My father, Richard Davenport, had been a force of nature, a man whose presence filled every room, whose laughter could sound like a celebration or a judgment, depending on which of his children he was looking at. Now that force was gone, reduced to a stack of paper in the hands of Mr. Davies, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of pained neutrality. My brother Peter sat beside me, but he might as well have been on another planet. He was a perfect mirror of our father in his youth, the same charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the same expensive suit that hung on him with an air of effortless entitlement. He'd leaned over before Mr. Davies began, patting my hand with a theatrical sigh. "It'll be okay, Flick," he'd murmured, his voice laced with the condescending pity he'd mastered over a lifetime. "Dad knew I'd take care of you." The implication hung in the air. Dad knew I couldn't take care of myself. My mother, Eleanor, sat on Peter's other side, a fragile-looking woman forged from iron. Her grief was a performance, elegant and manicured. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, her gaze flicking between her golden son and the lawyer, a silent urgency in her posture. She was the architect of the family dynamic, the one who taught us our roles. Peter was the star, destined for greatness. I was the stagehand, there to make sure his lighting was always perfect. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He began to read the will. It was full of the usual legal jargon, bequeathing small heirlooms and charitable donations, a slow and tedious prelude to the main event. I felt a familiar knot tightening in my stomach. It was the same knot I'd felt every time my father praised Peter for a mediocre business idea, while I quietly paid the bills for his last failed venture. The same knot I'd felt when my mother told me my PhD in colonial history was a lovely hobby, while Peter's business degree, from a mid-tier university, was framed and hung in our father's study. For years I had been the family's quiet fixer. When Peter's car was repossessed, I was the one who got the call. When a business partner turned out to be a con artist, I was the one who spent a month untangling the financial mess, never receiving so much as a thank you. My loyalty was a resource they mined without a second thought. And now Mr. Davies said, his eyes dropping to the final, most crucial page, "We come to the disposition of the primary real estate assets of the Davenport coastal estate." This was it. Generations of our family had lived and worked this land, a vast tract of pristine coastline in Seacliff County, a jewel of undeveloped splendor. The beachfront properties alone were worth a king's ransom: miles of white sand, rolling dunes, and panoramic ocean views. My father had always spoken of the land with a reverent hush, calling it our family's legacy. Mr. Davies continued, his voice flat, "To my son Peter Davenport, in recognition of his business acumen and his future-facing vision for our family's legacy, I bequeath, in their entirety, all beachfront properties, designated as Lots A through G, including the primary residence, the guest cottages, and all associated coastal access rights. A soft gasp escaped my mother's lips, a perfect little note of feigned surprise and delight. Peter's mask of solemnity slipped, replaced by a triumphant, predatory grin. He squeezed my hand, a gesture of dominance, not comfort. "Don't worry, Flick," he whispered, the sound slick with insincerity. "We're still a team." I felt nothing. It was a strange, hollow sensation, like watching a car crash in slow motion. You know the impact is coming, but you're too frozen to feel it. I had spent my life being the responsible one, the historian who lovingly curated our family's past, while Peter, the golden child, dreamed of paving it over. And in the end, our father had validated that narrative completely. And to my daughter, Felicity Davenport, Mr. Davies read, and I could have sworn his gaze softened with a flicker of actual pity. "I bequeath the remaining inland property, designated as the Blackwater Marsh Preserve, Lot H, in the hope that she will continue to act as its faithful steward." The Blackwater Marsh Preserve, Lot H. It sounded so official, so formal. Everyone in the family just called it the swamp. It was over 2,000 acres of soggy, mosquito-infested marshland, saltwater creeks, and impenetrable reeds. It was considered utterly worthless, an ecological buffer zone, the county required to prevent inland flooding. It was beautiful in its own wild, untamed way, a haven for seabirds and strange, brackish flora. But from a real estate perspective, it was a joke. It was the land you gave away for a tax write-off. My father had given Peter the diamond and handed me the velvet box it came in. My mother finally looked at me, her expression a masterwork of practiced sympathy. "Oh, Felicity, darling," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's what he would have wanted. He knew how much you love your nature walks. It's a sentimental gift, a sentimental gift." The words echoed in the silent room. Peter got the multi-million-dollar engine of our family's wealth, and I got a sentimental bog. The injustice of it was so profound, so absolute, it was almost comical. I felt a strange hysterical laugh bubbling in my chest, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep it down. Peter, ever the magnanimous victor, patted my shoulder. "Look, I'll tell you what. I'll give you a lifetime pass to the resort I'm going to build. You can come visit the beach whenever you want." And that was the hook. Not the will itself, but that single patronizing sentence. The assumption that I would simply accept this, that I would be grateful for the crumbs he offered from the table he'd just stolen. The idea that he would take my birthright and then sell me a ticket to visit it. It wasn't just an insult, it was an erasure. In that moment, they had made it clear I was not part of the family legacy. I was a footnote to Peter's story, and as I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of glass, and walked out of that office without a word, I knew one thing for certain. My entire life had been a prelude to this betrayal, and I had no idea what came next. All I knew was the quiet, simmering heat that was beginning to replace the hollow cold in my gut. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. At that moment, it was just about survival. The days that followed the reading of the will are a blur of gray. I went back to my small apartment in the city, a place I'd always considered a cozy sanctuary, but which now felt like a cage. It was filled with books on cartography, maritime history, and ecological preservation, the very passions my father had dismissed as a hobby and then used as a justification to disinherit me. I'd walk past the shelves, and the spines of the books seemed to mock me. I'd spent my life studying the value of things others overlooked, Yet I'd failed to see the worthlessness of my own position in my family. I didn't answer their calls. Peter left a series of breezy voicemails, full of talk about architects and investors, as if nothing had happened. "Hey Flick, just wanted to run a name by you for the resort's main restaurant, the Davenport Grill. Classy, right? Call me back." My mother's messages were different, laced with a cloying, manipulative sweetness. "Felicity darling, we're all so worried. You're being terribly dramatic. Your father wouldn't want you to be like this. It's for the good of the family. You must see that. For the good of the family." That phrase was the soundtrack of my childhood. It meant for the good of Peter. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself pulling out an old photo album. I was looking for proof, for evidence that there was a time before this, a time when I was seen. I found a picture from a family trip to the coast when I was 10. Peter, aged 12, stood proudly beside my father, holding up a small, pathetic-looking fish he'd caught. Both of them were beaming. In the background, almost out of focus, I was sitting on a rock, holding a perfect, intricate nautilus shell I had found. I was looking at it with a child's wonder, but no one was looking at me. The camera, held by my mother, was aimed squarely at the boy and his fish. The memory came rushing back with the force of a physical blow. I remembered that day so clearly. I had run up to my father, my hands cupped around the shell, shouting about the logarithmic spiral, a concept I'd just read about in one of his old science books. He'd ruffled my hair distractedly, his eyes already scanning the water for Peter's fishing line. "That's nice, honey," he'd said, his attention 1,000 miles away. A few minutes later, when Peter reeled in his tiny flounder, my father had boomed with laughter and swung him up onto his shoulders, declaring him the mighty fisherman, conqueror of the sea. I closed the album, the cheap plastic cover cold against my fingers. My entire life had been a collection of these moments. I was the background character, the set dressing for the grand play of Peter's life. I remembered my high school graduation. I was the valedictorian. I had a full scholarship to a prestigious university. My father clapped politely after my speech. 2 years later, when Peter scraped through his final year of college with a C- average, my parents threw him a lavish party, gifting him a brand new sports car to motivate him for the business world. When I gently pointed out the disparity, my mother had sighed her signature, long-suffering sigh. "Oh, Felicity, don't be difficult. Peter needs the encouragement. You've always been so self-sufficient." Self-sufficient. They said it like a compliment, but it was a condemnation. It was an excuse to neglect me. My competence was not a source of pride for them. It was a convenience. It meant they didn't have to worry. It meant they could focus all their energy, all their resources, all their love on Peter. My loyalty was a weapon they used against me, over and over again. The phone rang, shattering the painful silence. It was my best friend, Chloe. I'd been avoiding her, not because I didn't want to talk, but because saying the words out loud would make the humiliation real. Chloe was a razor-sharp real estate lawyer, and she didn't suffer fools gladly. She was the only person who saw my family for what they were. I let it ring 4 times before I finally picked up. "Hello," said, my voice barely a whisper. "Don't you hello me, Felicity Davenport," she said, her voice a welcome shot of sanity. I saw the announcement in the County Gazette, "Peter's Azure Point Resort. I've been calling you for 3 days, talk to me." And so I did. The dam of my composure finally broke, and the whole story came tumbling out. The lawyer's office, the will, the condescending pity, the worthless swamp. I cried, not with the elegant, dry-eyed grief of my mother, but with ragged, ugly sobs that came from a place of deep, old hurt. Chloe listened patiently, letting me exhaust my sorrow. When I was finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then she said, her voice dangerously calm, "Okay, first of all, your father was a world-class jerk. Let's just get that on the table. Secondly, your mother is a master manipulator who should teach classes at the CIA. And thirdly, your brother is a moron." I let out a wet, hiccuping laugh. "You think?" "I know," she said firmly. "Flick, did you get a lawyer to look at that will? A real one? Not the family lapdog?" "No," I admitted. "What's the point? It's ironclad. Mr. Davies said so." "My father's wishes, his wishes were garbage," Chloe snapped. "But you might be right. Contesting a will is brutal and expensive, and the emotional cost is even higher. They drag you through the mud," she sighed. "Okay, so legal challenges are probably out. What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air. "I don't know. Sell the swamp to a mosquito breeding consortium? Write a tragic book about salt marshes?" "Not funny," she said, though I could hear a smile in her voice. "Look, just take a week. Grieve, be angry, punch a pillow. Then I want you to go to the old summer house. You still have access to that, right? The will said it was in a separate trust for you both." "Yes," I said. The summer house was a small rustic cabin on a less desirable stretch of coast, a few miles from the main estate. It was the one place where the memories were less complicated. "Go there," Chloe said. "Get out of the city. Breathe some sea air. Clear your head. And pack up anything you want to keep before Peter decides to turn it into a parking lot for his resort staff. Just secure your history, Flick. It's the one thing they can't take." Her words struck a chord. Secure your history. It was what I did for a living. For other people. For dusty archives and forgotten towns. I'd never thought to do it for myself. A few days later, the catalyst arrived, not as a moment of quiet reflection, but as a glossy full-page ad in the Sunday paper. It was for the Azure Point Resort. A ridiculously over-the-top artist's rendering showed a glass and steel monstrosity sprawling across the pristine dunes I had played on as a child. The headline read, "Peter Davenport Reimagines a Legacy," but it was the article that went with it that lit the fuse. A fawning interview with Peter, the visionary young developer. He talked about bringing a new era of prosperity to Seacliff County. And then came the quote that changed everything. "My father always knew this land was meant for more than just sitting there," Peter said, his smarmy voice practically leaping off the page. He was a traditionalist, but he understood that you have to monetize tradition to make it matter. My sister Felicity, she's more of a preservationist. She's taking care of the family's nature preserve. It's wonderful that she has that passion project to keep her busy. A passion project to keep me busy. The newspaper crumpled in my fist. The casual public dismissal. The way he framed my inheritance as a little hobby to keep the spinster sister occupied, while he did the important work of men. It was a distillation of every insult, every moment of being overlooked, into one perfect poisonous drop. The grief that had been weighing me down for weeks didn't just disappear. It transmuted. It hardened, cooled, and sharpened into something else entirely. A cold, clear resolve. He wasn't just building a resort. He was rewriting our family's history, with himself as the hero and me as the quirky, irrelevant side character. And he was doing it on the land my ancestors had cherished. I stood up and walked to my closet, pulling out a dusty duffel bag. I was going to the summer house, just as Chloe had suggested. But I wasn't going to grieve anymore. I was going to secure my history, and then I was going to find out if there was anything in that history, anything at all, that they had overlooked in their rush to cash in the future. It wasn't about revenge. Not quite. It was about respect. It was about proving that the things they dismissed as worthless, including me, had a value they were too blind to see. The drive to the coast was a journey back in time. The further I got from the city, the more the concrete and steel gave way to pine forests and salty air. The old summer house was exactly as I remembered it, a simple, gray-shingled cabin nestled in a grove of wind-battered cypress trees. It was neglected, the paint peeling and the porch steps groaning in protest, but it felt more like home than the grand estate ever had. This was the place of scraped knees and bonfire stories, a place where my father's booming presence had been softened by the roar of the ocean. I spent the first day just being there, letting the familiar sights and sounds wash over me. I walked the rocky shoreline, collecting sea glass, just as I had as a girl. I wasn't looking for anything, just trying to reconnect with a version of myself that existed before the will, before the betrayal, but the peace was fleeting. Every time I looked west, I could just make out the distant strip of perfect white sand beach that was now Peter's kingdom. I imagined the bulldozers, and the construction crews, and the cold resolve returned. The next day, I tackled the attic. It was a dusty, cramped space, smelling of cedar and thyme. It was a jumble of forgotten things, holiday decorations, stacks of old magazines, a broken rocking horse. I was looking for photo albums, for letters, for anything that felt like mine. In the far corner, tucked under a canvas tarp, was an old sea chest made of dark, heavy wood, bound with tarnished brass. It had belonged to my great-great-grandfather, a sea captain named Alistair Davenport. Peter had never been interested in it. He'd once called it a clunky old box full of junk. I pried open the heavy lid. A wave of mothballs and ancient dust hit me. Inside, beneath a stack of brittle yellowed naval uniforms, I found it. It wasn't a diary or a letter. It was a long, heavy tube, made of worn leather, sealed with a cracked wax emblem of the Spanish crown. My heart began to beat a little faster. As a historian, I knew what these were. They were how valuable charts and maps were transported. My hands, trained to handle delicate artifacts, trembled slightly as I worked the cap loose. Slowly, carefully, I unrolled the document on the dusty floorboards. It was vellum, not paper, and the ink was a faded sepia. The cartography was beautiful, hand-drawn with an artist's flair. In the corner, a curling script read, Carta de Navegación de la Costa de los Acantilados del Mar. Anno Domini 1682, a shipping map of the Seacliff coast, from 1682. My eyes scanned the familiar coastline, rendered in an archaic, slightly distorted style. I saw landmarks I recognized, labeled with Spanish names, and then I saw it, my breath caught in my throat. Starting from the deep ocean and cutting inland, was a clearly marked channel, complete with depth soundings. It snaked its way through a landmass, labeled Las Ciénagas Negras, the Black Marshes, my marshes. The channel was wide, deep, and terminated in a small sheltered cove, marked with an anchor symbol, and the words Puerto Seguro, the safe port. My mind was racing. A deep water channel, a historically documented, 17th century deep water port. Right in the middle of my unusable swamp, I scrambled down the attic ladder, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. I brought up a modern satellite view of the county. I toggled on the topographical overlay. The geography of the coast was starkly clear. Outside of the major commercial port 3 miles south, the entire coastline of Seacliff County was a shallow, treacherous mess of sandbars and shifting shoals. It was beautiful to look at, but a nightmare for any vessel larger than a fishing skiff. I zoomed in on my property, Lot H. The satellite image showed a network of creeks and waterways, obscured by the dense marsh grass, but the topographical data confirmed it. Running like a hidden artery beneath the green expanse was a distinct depression, a deep trough that perfectly matched the channel on the Spanish map. It had been there for centuries, a secret carved by ancient tides, known only to a long-dead Spanish navigator. And now, to me, I immediately called Chloe. "You found a what?" she asked, her voice crackling over the phone. "A map, Chloe. A 17th-century Spanish shipping map. It shows a deep water channel, running right through my marsh. It calls it a port." There was a pause. "Flick, are you sure? Old maps can be aspirational, inaccurate. I'm a historian, Chloe. This isn't a treasure map from a cereal box. The soundings are precise. The coastline is accurate, allowing for 300 years of erosion, and the topography on the modern survey maps confirms it. The channel is there. It's just hidden." I could practically hear the gears turning in her legal mind. "Okay," she said slowly. "Okay, this is interesting. But what does it mean?" "So you have a private swampy waterway. Good for you. You can start a canoe rental business." "No, you don't understand," I said, pacing the cabin floor. "Think about Peter's resort, the Azure Point. Who is he trying to attract? Not families in minivans. He's selling luxury, exclusivity. He's marketing to the global 1%. What do those people have? Questionable morals, and their own private jets," Chloe quipped. "And super yachts," I said. "Mega yachts. Boats that are basically floating apartment buildings." His whole concept depends on being a destination for the international yachting set. A fancy hotel on a beach is nice, but a world-class resort needs a world-class marina. "Right," Chloe said, catching on. "And he can't build a marina on that shallow beachfront. He'd have to dredge a massive channel, which would be an environmental and logistical nightmare. The county would never approve it." "Exactly," I almost shouted. "But I don't need to dredge a channel. I already have one, a natural, deep water channel." There was another long, thoughtful silence on the other end of the line. When Chloe spoke again, her voice was different. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a tone of pure, unadulterated excitement. "Flick, I need you to get that map authenticated, and I need you to do it quietly. Then I need you to pull up the Seacliff County Planning and Zoning Ordinances. Specifically, look for Title 15, the Coastal Development Code. I think I remember something from a case a few years back." I spent the next 2 days in a fever of research. I found a retired professor at the State University who specialized in Iberian cartography. I sent him high-resolution, encrypted photos of the map. His reply came back within hours, filled with academic glee. "It was authentic," he said, "a rare and significant find." He even identified the cartographer, a known figure in the court of Charles II. Then I dove into the dry, tedious world of county ordinances. It took hours of scrolling through dense legalese, but then I found it. Section 1, 5.4, subsection C. The Historical Precedent Clause. It was an obscure little piece of legislation, added in the 1980s by a group of old money preservationists to fight off a wave of aggressive developers. It stated that any new construction of a major maritime facility, including deep water docks or marinas, within the county's protected coastal zone, was strictly prohibited unless the proposed site had a documented historical precedent for such use prior to the year 1900. I read the clause 3 times. My hands were steady now. The frantic excitement had been replaced by a crystalline, chilling certainty. My land wasn't just valuable. It wasn't just the key to Peter's success. It was the only place in the entire county where a marina for his resort could legally be built. He had given me a swamp. He had dismissed my passion for history, and in a stroke of cosmic irony that was almost too perfect to believe, he had handed me the one thing that combined them both into a weapon of absolute power. My unusable marsh and my hobby were about to become his entire world. A new feeling began to settle over me, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to experience in years. Confidence. It wasn't the loud, brittle confidence of my brother, but a quiet, deep-seated strength. I now had a secret, a powerful, history-backed, legally binding secret. The game had changed. They just didn't know it yet. It was no longer about what they had done to me. It was about what I was going to do next. And the first step was to do nothing at all. To wait, to watch, and to let my brother's arrogance become my greatest ally. The first move wasn't mine to make. It was Peter's, and it was exactly as arrogant and predictable as I'd anticipated. A month after my discovery in the attic, the Seacliff County Planning Board held its monthly public meeting. On the agenda was the preliminary permit application for the Azure Point Resort. Chloe and I drove down together, slipping into the back row of the drab, wood-paneled meeting room just as the proceedings began. Peter was in his element. He stood at the podium, flanked by a slick-looking lawyer and an architect who looked both talented and deeply uncomfortable. He presented his vision with a series of glossy renderings and charts projecting astronomical revenue for the county. He was charming, persuasive, and utterly confident. He spoke of jobs, of tourism, of putting Seacliff on the map. He was selling a dream, and the board members, mostly local business owners, were eating it up. Then came the marina. The architect, a man named Marcus Thorne, took over. He was younger than I expected, with a serious demeanor and intelligent eyes. He spoke about a state-of-the-art facility, an eco-conscious design. But as he clicked to a slide, showing the proposed location on Peter's beachfront property, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his presentation. He mentioned the need for significant and extensive dredging to create a navigable channel. That's when the board chairman, a grizzled old fisherman named Henderson, leaned forward into his microphone. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this board is well aware of the sensitive ecosystem along that stretch of coast, the sea turtle nesting grounds, the shellfish beds. What you're calling extensive dredging looks to us like a full-scale environmental demolition." Peter stepped back up to the podium, his smile unwavering. "Chairman Henderson, we would of course follow every environmental guideline to the letter. We plan to invest in mitigation efforts that will leave the coastline even better than we found it." An elderly woman on the board, a well-known local historian named Mrs. Gable, adjusted her spectacles. "There is also the matter of the historical precedent clause, Mr. Davenport. Our county charter is very clear. You cannot build a new port where one has never existed. It is the very law that has preserved the character and natural beauty of our coastline for the last 40 years. Peter's smile tightened just a fraction of a millimeter. "With all due respect, Mrs. Gable, that's an antiquated rule. We're talking about progress here, about economic vitality. Surely a minor administrative hurdle can be overcome for a project of this magnitude." Minor administrative hurdle. I saw Chloe smirk beside me. He had no idea. The board deliberated for less than 20 minutes. The verdict was swift. The general resort plan was approved in principle, pending further review. But the marina permit was denied, unequivocally. Denied due to environmental impact, and a complete failure to meet the requirements of the historical precedent clause. The room was silent for a moment. Peter stood frozen at the podium, his face a mask of disbelief. The charming facade had cracked, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. He turned to his lawyer and hissed something I couldn't hear. Then he stalked out of the room, his mother trailing in his wake, casting venomous glances around her, as if looking for someone to blame. Her eyes swept right past me, not even registering my presence. To her, I was still invisible. The panic started slowly, then accelerated. The denial of the marina permit was reported in the local paper, and Peter's investors, a consortium of faceless offshore financiers, started getting nervous. A luxury resort without a yacht-luring marina was a much riskier, less profitable venture. Marcus Thorne, the architect, later told me that the calls started coming in daily, demanding assurances, contingency plans, and a clear path to approval. Peter's strategy was to bully his way through. He hired a high-priced legal team from the city to find loopholes in the county charter. They found none. The clause was ironclad. He commissioned new environmental surveys, hoping to find a single stretch of his coastline that could be dredged without catastrophic consequences. Each report came back with the same conclusion. It was impossible. His frustration began to curdle into desperation, and that's when my phone started ringing again. This time, it wasn't just my mother, it was Peter. "Flick," he said, his voice strained, all pretense of charm gone. "I need you to do something for me." I remained silent, letting him talk. "This planning board is full of old fossils. They're stuck in the past. They're talking about history and tradition. You're the family historian. I need you to write a letter. To the board, to the newspaper. Talk about Dad's vision. Talk about how the family supports this project. 100%. You need to tell them that this is our shared legacy." It was breathtaking. He wanted me to use my credentials, the very expertise he and my father had mocked, to lend legitimacy to his scheme. He wanted me to publicly endorse the project that was built on my own disinheritance. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Peter," I said, my voice calm and even. There was a stunned silence. I had never in my entire life said no to him directly. "What do you mean not appropriate?" he sputtered. "This is the family's future we're talking about. Are you trying to sabotage me?" "Your resort is your project, Peter," I said simply. "It has nothing to do with me." "Nothing to do with you?" he shouted, his voice rising. "I'm doing this for us, for the Davenport name. Dad would be so disappointed in you right now. He'd be ashamed of your selfishness." The threat, the old, reliable guilt trip, landed with a dull thud. It had no power over me anymore. "I have to go, Peter," I said, and I hung up the phone. 2 days later, a package arrived. A thick, glossy brochure for the Azure Point Resort. Tucked inside was a handwritten note from my mother. "Felicity, this is what your brother is trying to build for our family. Do not let your jealousy stand in the way of his success. Your father is watching. It is your duty to help." I threw it in the trash without a second thought. Their panic was a tangible thing now, a frantic energy I could feel from miles away. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, rattling the bars and screaming, and they couldn't understand why the door wouldn't open. They had the money, the land, the name, but they were missing the one thing they needed, the one thing they had so casually and cruelly thrown away. The true first move was mine, and it was to be one of strategic silence. I forwarded the authenticated map data and the relevant county ordinances to Chloe, with a simple instruction: "Hold this. Wait for my signal." Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I went for a walk in my swamp. I rented a small skiff and motored slowly up the winding, reed-choked creeks. It was quiet, peaceful. Egrets took flight as I approached, their white wings stark against the deep green of the marsh grass. I cut the engine and just drifted. For the first time, I wasn't looking at it as a burden or a symbol of my family's scorn. I was looking at it as a place of hidden power, a sleeping giant, and as the tide slowly began to turn, I felt a sense of kinship with this overlooked, underestimated piece of land. We both had depths that no one had bothered to see. The power shift didn't happen with a thunderclap. It began with a quiet email. It was from Marcus Thorne, Peter's architect. The subject line was simply a question. He wrote that he had been doing his own due diligence on the history of the Seacliff coastline, hoping to find some obscure precedent that might help their case. He'd come across a passing reference in an old sailor's journal to a place called Porto Seguro. He wanted to know if, as the local historian, I had ever heard of it. It was a test, a carefully worded probe. I wrote back a simple, truthful reply. Yes, I am familiar with the name. It refers to a 17th-century Spanish shipping port located on the property now known as the Blackwater Marsh Preserve. I hit send and waited. The response came 2 hours later. Would it be possible to meet? I would be very interested to learn more. In a professional capacity, of course. We met at a neutral location, a small coffee shop in a neighboring town. Marcus was professional and direct. He had a quiet intensity about him that I respected. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mr. Davenport has been unclear about the full history of the family's land holdings, he began, stirring his coffee. He seems to believe that shouting louder than the zoning board is a viable legal strategy. I smiled faintly. That's a lifelong approach for him. I'm an architect, Miss Davenport, he said, looking me directly in the eye. I build things, I solve problems, but I can't solve a problem when my client withholds critical information and asks me to defy the laws of physics and jurisprudence. My professional reputation is on the line. He leaned forward slightly. Is it true? Is there a documented historical deep-water port on your land? This was the moment. He was the karmic agent, the unwitting truth-teller. He was a professional caught between an impossible task and an unscrupulous client. He was my first potential ally. I made a decision. I took a folded, high-quality copy of the Spanish map from my bag and slid it across the table. He unrolled it carefully, his eyes widening as he took in the details. He was silent for a long time, tracing the lines of the channel with his finger. He looked up from the map, then back down, then at me. A look of dawning comprehension, mixed with a healthy dose of professional outrage, spread across his face. He knew, Marcus said, his voice a low whisper. No, he didn't know. He couldn't have known. If he knew this existed, he wouldn't have. He gave you this land. He thought it was worthless, I said. Marcus shook his head slowly, a grim smile playing on his lips. Worthless. He has $100 million project, dead in the water, because he can't build a $10 million marina. And the entire time, the solution, the only solution, was right here. He tapped the map. This isn't just a piece of land, Miss Davenport. This is a key. It's the only key that fits the lock. He became my secret source. He didn't give me proprietary information. He was too ethical for that. But he confirmed what I already suspected. The investors were on the verge of pulling out. Peter was making increasingly irrational demands. The entire project was teetering on the brink of collapse. The exodus of power from my family had begun. The final, desperate counter-manipulation came, as I knew it would. My mother called, her voice choked with manufactured tears. "Felicity, you have to come to the house. We need to talk, as a family." I knew it was an ambush, but I also knew it was a necessary step. I had to face them one last time, on their turf, before I moved the battlefield to mine. I drove to the grand beachfront estate, the house where I had grown up feeling like a guest. Peter and Eleanor were waiting for me in the formal living room, the one with the huge picture window overlooking the now useless ocean. The air was thick with tension. They started with the soft approach. My mother spoke of family unity, of my father's legacy. Peter offered me a pittance, a consulting fee of a few $1,000s, if I would just write the letter to the board. When I politely refused, their tone shifted. "I don't understand you, Felicity," my mother said, her voice turning cold. "After everything this family has given you, what has this family given me?" I asked, the question genuine. "An education I earned myself, a deep-seated sense of inadequacy, a swamp?" Peter shot to his feet, his face red with anger. "A swamp? That land has been in our family for generations. You're spitting on Dad's memory by being so ungrateful. Dad gave you the beachfront, Peter," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "He gave you the value. He gave me the sentiment. His will made that perfectly clear. You were always jealous," he roared, finally saying the words he'd always believed. "You were jealous that Dad was proud of me, that he saw me as the future. You're a bitter, lonely woman who gets her kicks from reading dusty old books, and now you're trying to ruin me because you have nothing and no one." The words were meant to cut, to wound me in the old familiar places, but they glanced off. I looked at this raging, desperate man-child, and I felt nothing but a distant pity. He was so used to his power, so used to my deference, that he had no other tools. All he had was volume and vitriol. I stood up. "I think this conversation is over." My mother grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. "You will not walk away from this, Felicity. We are your family. You owe us your loyalty." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back up into her frantic eyes. "My loyalty was a weapon you used against me," I said, my voice devoid of heat. "You should have been more careful. You've disarmed yourselves." I pulled my arm free and walked out of the house, leaving them standing in stunned, furious silence. The power shift was complete. They had tried their threats, their manipulations, their guilt, and nothing had worked. They were out of ammunition. Now it was my turn to fire the first shot. The call came from Peter's lawyer, 2 days later, requesting a formal mediation. They were ready to make a more substantial offer. They still thought they were in control. They thought it was a negotiation, that I was just holding out for a bigger slice of the pie. They had no idea I was about to take the whole bakery. Chloe and I walked into the conference room of a neutral law firm downtown. It had the same generic soulless feel as Mr. Davies' office, but this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. I was no longer the bereaved, disinherited daughter. I was a landowner with a unique asset. Peter and Eleanor were already there, sitting beside their lawyer, a man with a weary, expensive face. They looked exhausted and angry. They tried to project an air of authority, but the desperation clung to them like cheap cologne. "Felicity," Peter's lawyer began, "my clients are prepared to be generous, in the interest of family harmony, and in recognition of your sentimental attachment to your property. They are prepared to offer you a one-time payment of $250,000 for your public support and for any minor easements we might require. He said it as if he were bestowing a great gift. Peter nodded, a smug look on his face, as if this was a magnanimous concession. I didn't even look at them. I turned to Chloe. Chloe opened her briefcase and pulled out a single neatly bound document. She slid it across the vast mahogany table. "We reject your offer," she said, her voice crisp and cool, "and we'd like to present you with our own." Peter's lawyer picked up the document, a confused frown on his face. He began to read. I watched as his eyes scanned the first page. His frown deepened. He flipped to the second page. His jaw went slack. He looked up at me, then back at the document, then at Chloe. A dawning horror crept into his expression. "What is this?" Peter demanded, his voice impatient. "What is it?" His lawyer didn't answer. He just stared at the paper, his professional composure completely shattered. "It's a proposal," Chloe said calmly. "My client, Miss Davenport, the sole owner of the Blackwater Marsh Preserve, the only legally viable location for a deepwater marina in Seacliff County, is prepared to offer you two options." She paused for effect, letting the words hang in the silent room. "Option A. Miss Davenport will sell you a precisely defined narrow channel easement through her property, granting your resort marina access to the deep water. The sale price for this easement will be 51% of the fully realized, independently appraised net value of the Azure Point Resort, transferred to Miss Davenport in the form of a majority, non-voting equity stake." Peter let out a strangled, incredulous laugh. 51%? Is she insane? For a right-of-way through a useless swamp? You have nothing. That land is worthless. I finally looked at him. For the first time, I met his furious gaze with my own, which was perfectly, serenely calm. "I don't have a swamp, Peter," I said, my voice even. "I have the only historically documented deepwater port in the entire county." Chloe slid a second document across the table. It was a certified, notarized copy of the 17th century Spanish map, complete with the university professor's authentication report, and a highlighted copy of the county's historical precedent clause. Peter's lawyer snatched it up. He read it, his face turning from pale to ashen. He looked at Peter, a look of utter defeat in his eyes. "He's right," the lawyer whispered. "Oh God, she's right." Eleanor looked back and forth between her son and her lawyer, her face a mask of confusion. "What? What is it? What does some dusty old map have to do with anything?" The lawyer looked at her with undisguised pity. "Eleanor," he said, his voice grim, "this dusty old map is the only reason a marina can be built, and it can only be built on her land. Without her, there is no marina. And without the marina, your primary investors walk. The entire project is dead." The new reality descended on the room like a physical weight. Peter stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant smirk wiped clean from his face forever. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut, the color drained from his face as the implications crashed down on him. The land he had mocked, the sister he had dismissed, the history he had ignored. They were now the absolute arbiters of his fate. Eleanor's face crumpled, not with grief, but with the impotent rage of a queen whose subjects have suddenly stopped obeying. "You can't do this," she hissed at me. "You can't do this to your own family. To your brother. You did this," I said, my voice holding no malice, only fact. "You and Dad and Peter. You wrote the rules of this game. I'm just playing by them." I stood up, the movement feeling deliberate and powerful. Chloe stood with me. "What's option B?" Peter's lawyer asked, his voice hoarse. "There is no option B," Chloe said. "But my client's offer for the easement is on the table for the next 24 hours. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table, and looked directly at my brother. After that, I have a meeting with a development group from Monaco. They're very interested in building an exclusive private yacht club. I hear they have a deep appreciation for properties with unique historical significance. And with that, we turned and walked out of the room. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. I could feel the gravitational collapse of their world behind me. I could hear the silence of their ruin. They had spent a lifetime making me feel small, insignificant, and worthless, and I had just proven that the worthless swamp they had given me was the most valuable thing any of us had ever owned. The vindication was so pure, so total. It felt like breathing for the first time. So what happened next? You might be imagining a dramatic, tearful reconciliation. A moment where my family finally saw the error of their ways and begged for forgiveness. That's what happens in the movies. It's not what happens in real life. In real life, people like my brother and my mother don't change. They just change their tactics. Peter had no choice but to accept my offer. His investors had given him a final ultimatum: secure marina access, or the funding was gone. 23 hours after our meeting, his lawyer sent over a signed letter of intent, agreeing to all my terms. The Azure Point Resort was built, a gleaming monument to my brother's ambition, and I became its silent majority owner. I never set foot in the place. I have a management firm, a team of professionals who handle my interests. They send me reports. They deposit the profits into a trust account I set up. Peter is the face of the resort, the one who gets his picture in the magazines. He plays the role of the visionary hotelier. And in a way, I suppose he is. But every time he looks out his office window at the fleet of gleaming yachts in the marina, he knows that the deep, calm water that makes it all possible flows through my land. He knows that every dollar of profit he makes is only 49 cents of the total. He has the stage, but I own the theater. We don't speak. I haven't seen him or my mother since that day in the lawyer's office. I hear things, of course. My mother tells her friends that I became greedy and ruthless, that I blackmailed my own brother. She paints me as the villain, the unnatural daughter who betrayed her family for money. Some people probably believe her. I've learned not to care about the opinions of people who only hear one side of the story. The truth is, it was never about the money. Not really. The first thing I did with the profits was establish the Seacliff County Historical Trust, an organization dedicated to preserving the very history my family was so eager to pave over. I funded the restoration of the old town hall. I created scholarships for students in history and ecology, and I poured resources into protecting the Blackwater Marsh. My marsh. It's now a designated wildlife sanctuary, with elevated boardwalks for visitors and a small research center. The deep water channel, my source of power, remains untouched. A quiet, dark ribbon winding through the reeds. They thought the value was in the sparkling sand and the ocean views. They saw the land as something to be conquered, developed, and monetized. They never understood that true value, the kind that lasts for centuries, is often hidden in the places no one else bothers to look, in the quiet resilience of a marsh, in the faded ink of an old map, in the silent strength of a daughter they wrote off. It's funny, isn't it? For years, I let them define my worth. I accepted the role they gave me, the sensible, boring, background character. I thought my loyalty and my quiet competence would one day be recognized, but it never was. It wasn't until they pushed me so far that I had nothing left to lose that I found out what I was truly capable of. It wasn't about revenge, until it was, but in the end, the most satisfying part wasn't watching them lose. It was watching myself win. And so now, I want to ask you, have you been made to feel small? Have you been told your passions are worthless? Have you been the one holding everything together while someone else takes the credit? Maybe your power isn't a 17th century map. Maybe it's a skill you've honed, a piece of knowledge you've guarded, a quiet integrity they've mistaken for weakness. Don't ever let anyone else tell you what you are worth. Sometimes, the greatest treasures are buried in the very places people have told you to abandon. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the overlooked one in your family, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about getting the last laugh. We all deserve to see the people who wronged us finally get what's coming to them.